Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just in the interest of time, I think we'll get started. So thank you everyone for joining our May Tech Talk. For those of you who are new here today, this just a brief introduction to the Technology Committee for which I co-chair. We're a group of urbanists and urban planners who convene on a monthly basis as part of the American Planning Association's Professional Society. We're based in the New York metro region, which spans most of the city and touches parts of the Hudson Valley and the surrounding jurisdictions. So today is our first ever virtual Tech Talk. We usually meet in person, but really appreciate everyone taking the time today during their lunch hour to join us remotely. So just a brief agenda for everyone on the call to give a little bit of structure to today's discussion. I'll be making a short introduction and introducing our speaker, and then we will be followed by a 30-minute presentation that Rawad will host, and then that will be followed by a Q&A discussion. So for those of you who usually attend our Tech Talks, they're very informal. I think today, since we are on a virtual platform, we'll need to have a little bit of structure with moderation. Feel free to use the chat feature. You can input your question into the chat feature, and then I will circle back to it during the discussion period and ask that question on your behalf. However, everyone is more than welcome to unmute themselves and ask their question directly to Rawad. We'll just sort of play that by ear and see how it goes. And just a note to the audience, the meeting will be recorded. So today it is my honor to introduce Rawad Chabasi, partner and director at Systematica, a transportation planning and mobility engineering consultancy. Rawad has a Master's of Science in Urban Planning and Innovation Management with a background in architecture. His work has touched on many large-scale projects from Tokyo to New York, and he currently leads a multidisciplinary team that works at every scale, from the regional to the local. So just checking that Rawad is in fact ready and on the line.
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to you so that you can start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can you tell me when you see my screen, please?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be also to see this amount of people watching this. I'm very happy to share this with you. So it's a 30-minute presentation. I'm going to make it as short as possible, but I'm just warning you, it's a bit dense because it starts very light and then moves a bit more into metrics, into the technical aspects, which we are experts on. So basically, the big question is, how does the available big data transform the way we plan cities? Very often, big data is a very good tool to read and analyze the existing, but how we can transform this into something that would become a tool for us, and how much this revolution is actually changing our processes. So I'm going to try to tackle this from different points of view, just to give you a very quick overview of who we are. Systematica and Transform Transport, which is a research unit owned by Systematica. We've just been doing transportation planning and mobility engineering for the past 3 decades. We're working in New York, in Europe, in India, and in the Middle East, where we have offices. So we've been participating to a number of very interesting research books and publications, and this is just a few of them on gender, on aging cities, on elder, on awareness. So this is part of our ongoing process. So I'm not going to spend much time. I want to just start with a big question: how disruptive technologies are imposing a change to our planning design process. I'm going to jump back in history for a second. Well, a bit too much in history, but I think it's interesting. If we look at what was happening, I mean, here we're just reflecting on the role of the planner. In 1775, Ledoux is the instrument of the ancient regime trying to define the master plan. Just the master planning was about looking at things from above, trying to give a new order and trying to impose a new order. And I think if we look at history just a few years after this whole thing ended up by a revolution, and it was not what people wanted, it did not reflect people's ideas. And eventually in 1799, the revolution ended and a few things changed. Then the same city, Paris, just went back into another process. And the reason why I'm seeing this, I just want to focus on the role of the master planner. The master planner is correcting something. He's trying to be, let's say, the man or the person who reflects what the authority wants. And that period was very funny that we were talking as well about disease and about distancing and about rethinking our streets. And again, what this led was destruction, reconstruction, distancing again. So this was the approach to planning historically. Well, this was not the case up till our recent decades for sure, but there was something pretty consistent. There were 5 more major steps. Someone decides, the politicians, we as planner, we work on the plan, we go into implementation, we start operation, and then we validate, or we start looking at what are the consequences of what we plan. But very often, the time that passes between decision making and validation, it can be 10 years, it can be 20 years, it can be even more. So it's not just about whom to blame, it's about that distance between decision making, planning, and seeing results was part of the planning mentality. And I think as we start seeing data being brought in, and as we see that our approach is becoming more and more data driven, this process is somehow being squeezed, is crunching. The reason for this is that we start as we squeeze time, we start having the possibility to do multiple projects together. And this is, we feel and we see it, it's developing, it's making planning not just a linear process, it's making it something much more complicated. And our thesis is that it's transforming planning from a linear to something microscopic, self-corrective, iterative process that operates on every front in multiple disciplines. So this is something, it's very abstract, but at the same time, we think that in a nutshell, it's somehow moving that paradigm from a rigid path to an iterative path, or from selective path to something adaptable. So here where we see big data is a very rich medium. It's a place where we're not aware of it right now because this has been going on for a few years, but we think that as this moves in time, we're going to see a very interesting shift in this paradigm. So just to use a human metaphor, maybe it's not adequate, but just looking at this picture, it's taken from the Harvard website. It's all about moving from looking at structures into looking at the nervous system. So it's a moment in time, it's historic, because we never had that. We never had a city that's that receptive and that rich with information that can be collected. So that's the reason why we've been using the big data, convinced of its potentials. So the second big question is how the big data we are using is in reinforcing the user-centric planning and how we're establishing a common code of understanding. We think this is interesting for 2 things. One is this big data is going more and more into the local. We're trying to dissect cities into districts and districts into neighborhoods and neighborhoods into blocks and so on. On the other hand, there's something universal going on, which is transforming this into a common code of understanding, because we're starting to use the same measurement unit that we use everywhere. So this is again something which we feel is really interesting and really disruptive. I'm going just to give some examples. This is Moovit. Moovit basically it's just it's a company. They collect data from cell phones and they focus basically on public transportation. And there's a new city that's added every 15 hours. Obviously, we're talking about cities of every scale. So I think that this approach is starting to show something. Moovit is being enriched from bottom up. It has more than 20,000 movitors that they are hackers, they are ICT experts, they are urban planners, they're just students, so much happy to share information online and to open this data. This is one example. Another example, I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with these, but when we look at the tapes to segmentation data that is being developed by Esri, it's interesting. Again, we're just not looking at numbers, but we're trying to segment people's preferences. We're trying to know more in detail what we prefer. This might also be controversial because we might say, well, professional pride is not really people from 40 years old with an average income of 132K. This is something we can't argue, but we think that this is something that we never talked about, perhaps in the past decade. So if we look at what Streetlytics is doing, for instance, they're overlapping this tapestry information, they're putting it on movement information, and we're starting to have a very interesting idea about not just the traffic volumes or the daily volumes or the annual volumes, but we're trying to understand what are the categories of people, what are the preferences of people moving on that street or on another. Still, I'm not defending any of these. I'm just saying that this might be a very interesting start to something that in 10 years from now might become really robust and consolidate. If we look at what we were using, we as transportation engineers, we've been looking at manuals for a long time, and it's respect to everything that was done by ITE. I think they did a great job in a moment in time when we had no reference, but to look at previous case studies. So the concept was that I do empirical survey, I look at everything that happened numerically. So I go to an office building, I try to understand what's the relationship between square meters and parking slots. Excellent. And then I apply this to future developments. So this is something which was very good up to 10 years from today. And then something is starting to revolutionize this. And we're starting to look at something which looks more at not at the average or a rule of thumb. We're getting more and more in detail in the specificities of every single movement in a city. This is an example of a shopping center we did with Bjarke Ingels in Champs-Élysées in Paris, where we have analyzed day by day every type of all the retail units that are on the street. And 10 years from now, we're using one curve that was representing every retail retail unit. Today, we're looking at a multitude. We're looking at the details. We can distinguish of how a Disney store would be different from Louis Vuitton, and it is. So we feel this is something. This is popular. Google Popular Times. We all know it. It's just about collecting the data and putting it together, and we start seeing a very interesting panoramic of how data is being consolidated. So when we work on a project, this is a project we worked in Poland, for instance, we needed to know how museums are moving. We did not get a museum generic profile. We go there to the same city, we have the Popular Times, and we are able to understand how museums in that specific context is behaving. So this is something which goes back to my point where we're moving local, we're tailoring our assumptions. For patients, so I think the first point is that the role of city users and citizens will become increasingly part of the planning process, actively by participating, just like what we've been doing, and passively by sharing the information. Two, the big data has the capability of making the decision-making process much more democratic and eventually strengthening community bonds. This is an interesting point. And when you talk about being more democratic, I go back to my first slide, to that non-democratic approach. And as we move and as we use these tools, they are objective tools, and they are tools that involve every single person, not just one or two decision makers, this becomes much more democratic. The third, it's about the advanced data-driven planning approach, which I showed you, will most likely replace traditional forecasting methods. Perhaps we don't need to forecast. We don't need to forecast 20 years from today. We still need our strategic plans, but perhaps we cannot and we do not want to know if cars are coming, if there's an annual growth of traffic of 2% per year, because we know that vocabulary is changing, everything is changing. So I don't think we can really forecast 20 years from now. And the last point is that planning and implementation processes will become inseparable. There's no planning and implementation. We implement as we plan, and we plan as we implement. So these are my simple takeaways. I'm sure we have more takeaways. I'll be very happy to respond to your questions, and I hope I was not too boring for you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So Rawad, I might ask that you stop sharing your screen so that we can enter the gallery view and see everyone who's in the meeting. Wonderful. Great, thank you everyone. We have great turnout today, and I see that there are some questions coming through in the chat feature. I'm just going to get us kicked off. So Rawad, I'd like to ask you to maybe speak a little bit more to the role of the citizen in the creation and collection of the big data. I see there are a couple questions in the chat that are sort of speaking to potential inequalities that are sort of baked into the big data from its conception. And maybe if you could speak to sort of the role of urban planners to ensure that this data is being equitable at its source.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so let me start with the first one. The first one, just a general disclosure, I don't want to sound an advocate for big data. I believe there's a huge potential out of that, and we need to somehow exploit it. So yeah, the involvement is I think the Move It example was an interesting one. There is a huge involvement still to be critical about it. Actually, this data is being sold, so this is bad. And I'm sure this is going to change in the very, very near future. But we knew it that to make this data and to make it available off the shelf, there's a huge amount of federal funds in the US that we use to make it available. So yes, we have lots of involvement, but I call it the passive involvement. You're passively involved because you're just accepting that your data anonymously, obviously, is being shared and being put in a global basin, which I think is a very generous thing that we can do. Now, I missed the second question. I remember inequalities, and yes, I had lots of maps on Los Angeles. Actually, we did lots of mapping on inequalities in Los Angeles, and there was part of this research that I did not share with you. It was showing the unemployment versus the distribution of wealth. It was showing also crime rates within Los Angeles. And we were looking at big data to understand how much these distinct and different types of areas within the same megapolis are interacting. And the evidence was very, very interesting because we saw relationships between similars that was happening in a very complicated place like Los Angeles. So it's a pity I did not share this part, but that was one of our focus points when we worked on the bigger scale. When we jumped into Torrance, that was a bit more difficult because if you want to come up with such conclusions, you cannot work in a city of 100,000 inhabitants with almost the same income level. You start losing that distinction. But when you look at Los Angeles, comparing downtown Santa Monica and the slightly poorer places, you start seeing this inequality in a very clear manner. And big data was not hiding that. It was just emphasizing this. I think I missed one point.
No, I think you answered the question, but I will follow up with two questions from the chat that are related. The first one, I think, is just a point of clarification for the LA example. Is the income data synthesized from the census data, or is it already in the data in some way, which I believe you sort of spoke to already? And then a second question from Miriam. Do you incorporate any firsthand or primary source data, such as surveys or interviews? And then additionally, what is the typical duration of each project from the inception to final analysis and recommendation? So that's a two-part question.
Yeah, okay. All right. Let me start with the first one. So income data is coming from the census data. Yes, we have that, but the big data provider is also incorporating that information within the movement information. So to be honest, just exactly what's going inside their kitchen is something that we've been trying to get in. But again, there are lots of restrictions in that sense, which I do understand, because it's something that I don't understand partially, but yeah, we know to a certain extent that we have to trust what's being processed, because the amount of information and the continuous flow of information does not allow us to go into their algorithm and test them, but we trust that what's being done is correct. And the reason for this is that the reason why we validated some of this data, it was exactly this. So we basically validated land use. We tried to understand, we looked at the curves, and then we looked at the land use, and we saw lots of correlation. We looked at the income data, and then we looked at the census income data. So yes, it is integrated. The third question is about the duration. From the moment we get the data, it took us from 2 to 3 months to finish the whole thing. But I would say that the data, the processing part was the longest one. It's just because we were working on this, in that moment we were working on this from Milan, from Europe. So we're accessing the cloud in the US, and there was lots of time. I think if we were to do it in the US to our New York office today, this would be done in roughly 1 or 2 months. And I think I missed the second question because I was not taking note, and I'm going to get my notepad.
No, you answered it, so I really appreciate that. And thank you everyone who's putting questions in the chat. I'm going to open it up to sort of an informal conversation in just a bit. So one more question from me, since I have the stage temporarily. I believe in your presentation, at least in the introduction to your presentation, you sort of talked about the potential for an iterative future of planning, and how the field of planning is kind of compressing as we augment with all of these interdisciplinary features and areas of focus. And one thing that you and I have spoken about just together is sort of this idea of big data being a tool, but how it can be maybe tamed or steered to be truly effective and truly transformative to urban planning. And so I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more broadly to how you could give an example of taming big data.
Yeah. I think the first step is to make people more familiar with this data, because very often, at least myself, before getting that data, before purchasing the data and paying thousands of dollars to get that data, we didn't have hands-on experience on that data. So I think the first thing is to open up a bit more the data, which I think is going to happen in the coming years, because this is the natural path. Something else would be coming, and this data would be just like any open source data. So I think this is one. The second one is that this approach starts being more and more shared with planners. It's just not about coming up with big major statistics, or writing an article about the differences and the indices. And there are lots of interesting output that this data, but this is, I think, is fraction of the potential of this big data. What it showed today was a mental mathematical effort. When we did this exercise, we did that with a sociologist, with a mathematician, and with a set of GIS analysts. So we had to put all our brain cells in trying to see how we can do something different from this, not just reading the data, because reading it is good, but how we can transform that into a tool. So I think the answer is, one, we have to make it familiar, and two, we have to squeeze our brain cells a bit more.
Great, thank you. And a question from Rebecca. What is the role of technology companies who write the APIs or data processing infrastructure in the cloud in planning that will incorporate big data? And Rebecca, feel free to jump in if you'd like to clarify the question.
Yeah, I think I got the question, but Rebecca, please jump in if you feel there's a need. Operators, so far, they've been doing a fairly good job. I know that in Germany and France, I'm sure, they have participated to writing the regulatory framework. So they're working a lot on how to make this safer. They are integrating some geofencing technologies within their systems so that, one example is the speed limits. If I have an area of, let's say, 24 kilometers per hour speed limit and I get into a city center, then it goes down to 18 automatically. So the operators have been working a lot on the operational side because they are good operators. They've been doing something interesting also on trying to reduce the carbon footprint, because part of micromobility's cost, a big chunk is operations, and the biggest not just cost in terms of monetary cost, but it's also environmental cost, because redistributing these devices is becoming more and more problematic, because sometimes we use just our diesel vans to redistribute them. So they are developing some swappable battery technologies. They are developing lots of interesting. The gig economy is helping a lot. So I think this is what they're doing so far.
Great. I know we have a question from the audience regarding your micromobility case study. If Samuel Sklar is on the line, I invite him to ask that question now.
Hey, everybody. Rawad, thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. My question is just, I obviously don't have the experience of sitting with these data and doing the kind of trying to replicate your results. But what I noticed was a lot of the R-squared kind of residual analysis were around 0.5 or lower. And so my question is, what do you do with the unknown unknowns here? How do you try to predict or plan around the non-explanatory behavior of some of the data you've collected?
Yeah, thank you very much, Samuel. This is a very good question. And it actually scares me to what degree you were looking at the slides. So yeah, it's that's part of what we've been doing. It is almost impossible to get very good correlation levels. And there were some exercises that we did, actually, which I did not put here, is that before deciding on the characteristics of the city, we started, just to give you an example, we started with more than 90 characteristics that were coming from statistical sources. And we started doing significance exercises to understand what are those parameters that are most influential. So when we were getting to 0.4, we were very happy, because it was almost impossible, because it's tough. Urban planning is very complicated, and you have to move from reasoning in absolute terms to relative terms. So if something is giving you 0.4 and something else is giving you 0.01, then you say, okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm focusing on this one. Still, you live with that parameter with all the doubts you have, because you know that it's not a 0.85 correlation that you would love to achieve. So yeah, I think we're navigating amidst all the uncertainties of also mathematical uncertainties. Just to complete this, we used neural networks and did not work well. So just to be very frank, it's a nice thing to exercise with, but it's exactly because the data was not complete and the correlations were never perfect, and it was almost impossible. But we lived with the best.
Thank you. That's a good answer. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, and I'd like to invite anyone to participate. Just unmute yourself and jump in, and if there's a little bit of overlap, that's fine. I'm just going to quickly make sure I didn't miss any questions in the chat. Okay, so just in the interest to keep the conversation going, I do have a pandemic-related question, not to, by any means hijack the conversation, but I do feel that it's related. I was wondering, Rawad, if you could speak to the very real and very terrifying potential future in a post-COVID-19 world where people become more interested and more reliant on personal vehicle travel. And of course, tying this back to the discussion topic today, can we forecast a solution or anticipate a solution using these big data methodologies that you've mentioned to have a better and maybe more connected future city?
Yeah. Well, this is on our minds everywhere. Today we're working. Actually, I invite you to go to the Transform Transport website. We've been doing a number of exercises. First, our approach has always been when we face this pandemic question is modesty. We just try to share information, because I think jumping to conclusions in 3 months is never sane. It's never good, never correct. So I think the first step is to share information and to make sure that this information is shared with everyone. So we worked with Sidewalk Labs, for instance, to develop a similar map to what was done in New York using very similar algorithm. We worked very closely with the team, and we did develop Milan sidewalk map. And that map was just showed in a split second that 45% of the sidewalks are not sufficient to keep this distancing. So that was an interesting tool because everyone was using that. I'm not sure how much they're using it, but it was a potential tool to be used. And similar examples were done. So just to be brief on this, I think the best thing is that we share the information. We try to make it as reachable as possible to people. And I'm sure that everything we're doing today is just a starting point of a much longer process, because now we learned something that we might need to change the use of our city just overnight. And this is something that big data wouldn't solve. But if we keep on reading and monitoring big data from now till hopefully many years from now, we have a similar problem. We're ready, we're robust, we're resilient. So I think this is the best way, is just to be as modest as possible, to respect the information and share it as much as possible.
Thank you. Any questions as we wrap up? If not, I will just take a final question. And Rawad, if you have anything you'd like to add or maybe mention, just I think sort of scanning the participants we have here, we have a diverse range of, I see a lot of urban planning professionals, but also emerging professionals who are just coming out of graduate school. So I don't know if there are any sort of final remarks you would like to make to us.
Can I ask one small question? It's kind of, sorry, it kind of continues from his last comment, which says that the use will change, and that really interests me. The use as in, because if the mode of transport changes, the use of the city will change. And I was wondering how, what will be the relationship of the use and the transportation in an urban context going forward from here?
Yeah, well, it's tough to predict, but let me give you an example. When we were all, and we're still actually locked down. We're talking about. I'm residing right now in Milan. It's very funny that Milan and New York are the two epicenters in the world. So when we're locked down, we were looking at all the data, and we noticed that almost all travel distances were going down to something around 500 meters, where you just walk to your grocery shop, you get whatever you need, and you go back home. So it was interesting. We started working with the guys that gave us the micromobility data, and we were saying that basically we're all transformed into micromobility devices, because we're not moving more than 1 kilometer, because we're trying to avoid unnecessary travel. So I think from that, I'm using this story to say that this is one way of how our behavior changed because we reacted to a very specific type of problem. I think if we're to be resilient, we should expect that we might need to change behavior in 10 ways or 20 or hundreds of ways that we cannot know today. Perhaps there might be some other, if we look at other disasters or other, if we just look at remote working in general, if we all decide just to keep on working from home in 20 years from now, then all the dynamics would change. And I think this would be, then again, to avoid predicting, I would say let's create scenarios perhaps. One scenario is what we're living today, but we can imagine many of these. And for each scenario, the data we have is a very good data source.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was just interested because I work in capacity analysis, and I was just wondering how, like, if the mode of transport changes, then the city as we know it changes. So how we will change the use of the city. And I know we're still figuring all of that out. So it was interesting to hear your comments from your point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a call for final questions. Ah, Rawad, I see you.
Yeah. Actually, I was avoiding to use it just because my connection is not very good. But I just wanted to say goodbye to everyone and thank you very much for this. It was a real pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was very dense, but it's part of what we do daily. So we're very happy to take this discussion offline. Just write us on LinkedIn, write us on all our web pages. So please feel free. I think it should be a never-ending discussion. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. We thank you so much. Really appreciate you calling in all the way from Milan. And thank you to everyone who participated. Emails for Rawad and the technology committee are in the chat box. As he mentioned, please feel free to reach out. And thank you. So maybe a round of virtual applause. Feel free to use the reaction button. I'm going to clap. But thank you so much, Rawad. And
Thanks. Thank you very much.
We hope to continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot. Stay safe, and hopefully we chat soon somewhere else. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.